Hello, it's Chino here. If you like chess openings, you're in the right place. Today, I'd like to show you a system against the Caro Kann. So, for those of you who don't have a lot of time to study chess openings, this one's for you. So yeah, I'll be looking at this from the white side. So yeah, after e4, c6, introducing the Caro Kann, and the most popular move for white here is pawn to d4. Staking, claiming the center of the board. But you need to know a little bit of theory to be able to play that move successfully. But a shortcut I'll recommend here is knight to f3. Now, when white plays knight to f3, he's not really showing his cards just yet because after black plays pawn to d5, um, white has the option of playing knight to c3 in this position, which happens to be the most popular move in my database. However, a surprising move here, and for those of you who don't have time to study, is this move, and pawn takes d5. Now, the correct response for black here would be to play pawn takes pawn, because queen takes pawn would simply lose a tempo to knight to c3. So yeah, after pawn takes pawn, here's our surprise, knight to e5. So we've just disobeyed one of the main or more common rules of thumb in the opening by moving the same piece twice. But this move has a particular specific purpose. White wants to play bishop to b5 check on the next move, which would make knight to c6 impossible. Or, if black meets bishop to b5 check with knight to c6, black would lose a pawn. Now, in this exact position, there are several ways for black to respond. Our main line would start with knight f6, but there's also knight to c6, pawn to e6, pawn to a6, and even knight to d7. I'll just quickly mention that after a move like knight to d7, a simple move is pawn to d4, and the game continues. There's not much to discuss here. It's not very theoretical. Both sides would just have to play chess. Taking that move back and go back to the position. Another try for black in this position is knight to c6, but I won't spend too much time on this here because it transposes to the variation after knight to f6. So we'll come back. In this position, white would play bishop to b5. Yeah, and after something like bishop to d7, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, c3, knight f6, etc., we'll get a transposition to our main line. Okay, so just going back, in this position, another try for black is to play pawn to e6. I don't like this move because it blocks in this bishop on c8. So I think white gets a slightly better position after pawn to d4. And after the natural knight to c6, bishop to b5. Bishop to d7, we see this move again, trying to prevent white from winning a pawn on c6. Knight takes d7, queen takes d7, pawn to c3. And a possible continuation here is knight to f6, just continuing to develop. But after castles kingside and something like bishop to d6, knight to d2 would be a good move. The point being the knight's keeping an eye on the e4 square. And after castles kingside, rook e1. And yeah, I think white has a slightly better position here. With correct play, it should be drawish, but yeah, even after something like queen to c7 coming out the pin and attacking h2, white would simply just play pawn to g3. The bishop can always come back to d3. White can try and gain some activity in the center and on the king side. But yeah, this is one way of playing. Um, Going back to that key position, now a very curious reply for black in this position is the move pawn to a6. That puts, yeah, a stop to any ideas of bishop to b5. And there is a curious drawing line in this variation. It's a pretty long one, so I'll just run through the moves pretty quickly. So after the standard move, pawn to d4, note that white almost always follows up knight to e5 with pawn to d4. Knight to c6 is a standard response for black in these types of positions. Pawn to c4 is a key move. Obviously, pawn takes c4 won't be such a great idea, because after knight takes c6, pawn takes c6. White has a slightly better pawn structure. Yeah, this central pawn's a bit better than this pawn on c6. So for that reason, I'm just going back to the position after pawn to c4. The main line goes something like knight to f6. And I'll just take that back for a second. It's just worth pointing out here that knight takes e5 as well. Isn't anything special, because after this move, black would have to play pawn to e6. I mean, pawn takes pawn would allow queen takes d8, when black would lose castling rights. So yeah, and after pawn to e6, just a simple bishop to e2. And yeah, it's another position where white's just slightly better. I mean, it should be drawn with best play. But yeah, it's just an unambitious way to play, but yeah, a reasonable one if you don't have time to study openings. Okay, so just going back to that key position after pawn to c4. The main line, and the one that leads to the very interesting variation I'm about to show you, is knight to f6. And now we have knight to c3. And this is the start of a long sequence that leads to a drawish position. So we go knight takes e5. Obviously, white has to recapture. Now, instead of moving the knight from f6 and losing time, losing the knight would lose a pawn on d5. Black correctly plays pawn to d4. But after pawn takes f6, pawn takes c3, queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, and a very important move here, pawn takes e7, much better than pawn takes g7. I'll just take that back and just point out, yeah, pawn takes g7 would be bad, because this bishop is now a monster on the diagonal. I mean, pawn takes pawn is threatened already. And if rook to b1 to try and defend this pawn, bishop to f5 is very annoying. So yeah, not a good idea. So yeah, just going back to the position. So hence pawn takes e7 check instead of pawn takes g7. Bishop takes e7, and after pawn takes c3, white's temporarily a pawn up, but the problem is that these pawns are doubled, and black will almost forcibly win back one of the pawns. So sample variation is bishop to f6. This is a key move for white here. The key move is to play king to d2, because something like bishop to to b2 would be very passive and would allow rook to e8 check. So king to d2, defending the pawn. And then after something like bishop to e6, attacking c4. White doesn't have much better than to play king to c2. I mean, he can't really defend this pawn. Something like rook to b1, for example, would just simply be met by king to c7, or even king to c8. So yeah, just going back. So king to c2, but then after something like rook to c8, yeah, we see that this pawn's gone. Okay, bishop to e2, just continuing to develop. Bishop takes c4, rook to d1 check. The king has to go somewhere, so obviously you can't go here because the bishop on c4 would be hanging, so king to e8. Bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, attacking c3. Rook to d3, critical move, protecting c3. And king to e7 because this rook has to come out from the corner. Bishop to a3, check. King to e6. Rook to e1, check. King to f5. And we get a draw. Rook to f3, check. And the point is that after something like king to g6, I mean, white can keep checking with rook to g3 and check. So yeah, this position is drawish. Because after rook to g3, king to f5, etc. White can't really capture this, trap this king. Yeah, that's a very curious variation after that line with pawn to a6. Okay, so going back to the opening position after knight to e5, our main line is knight to f6. And after our move d4, which we almost always play after knight to e5, and yeah, we see that transposition I talked about, knight to c6 and bishop to b5. Yeah, transposes. Just going back 2 moves. In this position, there's a curious continuation here for black, and that's to play pawn to g6. So yeah, trying to put the bishop on this diagonal. Obviously not wanting to play e6 to lock in this bishop. But here after bishop to b5 check, and knight b to d7. Note if the bishop had gone there instead, knight takes d7 would be possible. Yeah, would be possible. Or maybe just bishop back to e2. And here white would just simply castle. And after bishop to g7, rook to e1. A few developing moves, and this is just standard chess. The better player, yeah, would win in this position. I mean, white has a small plus in the position because this bishop is locked in by this pawn, and white has a more coordinated pieces. Okay, going back to the opening, not digressing too much. After pawn to d4 and knight to c6, bishop to b5, threatening to win a pawn on c6, bishop to d7. Yeah, we see a transposition to a position we saw earlier. So in this position, white would usually play pawn to c3. And I think it's probably time to follow a game. So this one's between Smirin and Salgado Lopez from St. Petersburg 2018. And it's a blitz game. But it just goes to show, even though it's a blitz game, it's quite interesting because it just goes to show how black could easily drift into a worse position from a seemingly innocuous position. So after pawn to c3, Salgado Lopez played pawn to g6, Smirin castled kingside, and after bishop to g7, rook to e1. See, both sides are just playing standard developing moves. Knight to d2, pawn to e6, pawn to a4. And this move is good in the sense that it stops black from expanding with pawn to a6 and pawn to b5. A6, bishop to d3. I mean, if you take stock of this position, black's pieces are pointing towards the king's side. Sorry, white's pieces are pointing towards the king's side. And it's not clear what black's plan is in this position. It's also worth pointing out that white has the 2 bishops as well. So yeah, it's not clear how black's going to counterattack in this position. Whether to go rook b8 and b5, which would be a bit suspect because white can always, keep a bind on the b5 square with queen to e2. Yeah, so in this position, Salgado Lopez played rook f to c8. Obviously putting a rook on the open file. White just continued developing naturally with knight to f3. Just see how easy it is for white species to develop without even too much calculations or thought. Knight to a5, probably wanting to plant the knight on c4, was black's continuation. But now the funny thing is, in this position, the engine's already screaming the white's better, and even suggesting moves like pawn to h4. Unbelievable. But here, Smirin went for the more human move, knight to e5, with tempo, so the knight's going to a commanding square and threatening the queen at the same time. The queen had to move, so she went to e7. And now bishop to g5. So already the threat is knight to g4, trying to take advantage of the pin on the queen. Yeah, and it's worth noting here, if black were to try pawn to h6, the bishop would simply go back to h4, just maintaining an annoying pin. And the point is, after g5, black's king position will be somewhat weakened. Okay, so Salgado Lopez moved the queen from the pin, went back to c7. But after queen to f3, oh, another annoying threat on this knight on f6. So the knight obviously had to go back to e8 because e4 wasn't possible because of bishop takes e4. So knight to e8. And then knight to g4, and yeah, lo and behold, we can see the white's attack is starting to gain some momentum. I mean, knight to h6 is a possibility in some lines. Yeah, Salgado Lopez tried knight to c4, attacking the b2 pawn, but after the calm rook e2 defending the pawn, it was clear that white was on top. Knight e to d6 happened, but it's not clear where this knight's going because, well, he's supporting the knight on c4, but e4 isn't an option. And d4, I mean, would give white the option of capturing at some point to ruin black's pawn structure. Anyway, in this position, Smirin played h4, the move that the engines were yearning for earlier, but better late than never. And now to stop this pawn advance to h5, and black played pawn to h5. So white played knight to f6 check. Bishop takes f6 happened, otherwise that knight would be very annoying on that square. I mean, it's just to point out something here. If king to h8, for example, instead, there is a pretty combination for white here. Pause for a minute and see if you can find it. Okay, I'm sure you paused and you found it, and if you did, congratulations. The brilliant combination here would be rook takes e6, exclamation mark. Now, the point of this move is that after something like pawn takes e6, bishop takes e6, g6, sorry, and there's not a lot that black can do to prevent queen takes h5 check, leading to checkmate. So, for example, bishop takes f6 would allow queen takes h5 check, and after king to g8, bishop takes f6 and queen to h5 cannot be stopped. At least not without losing material. I mean, with queen to g7, but that's ridiculous. So just going back to the position after knight to f6 check. yeah, this position. So yeah, we've just seen why king to h8 is a bad idea because of this brilliant combination. So black played bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and then it's quite clear that there are some serious weaknesses on the black squares around the king. I mean, bishop to h6 would be threatening mate in one, although white would have to try and prepare it. Okay, so here, Salgado Lopez played knight to e8 to chase the queen. But after queen to f3, I mean, black's struggling for a plan in this position. He really is. He tried knight c to d6, but then here comes another combination. Bishop takes g6. This is all possible because of the weakness around the black king. Yeah, black squared weaknesses and the vulnerability of the pawns. And the point of this was that after pawn takes g6, rook takes e6 with a strong threat of rook takes g6 check and queen takes d5. And black saw nothing better than to play queen f7 defending the g6 pawn, but he has the hidden move, queen takes d5. And the point is rook takes g6 check is a big threat because the queen won't be able to capture the rook because of this pin on the diagonal. Yeah, and there wasn't much that black could do in this position. I mean, knight to f5 would still allow rook takes g6 check. In the game, Salgado Lopez played rook to c6, but then after rook takes g6 check, knight to c7, and rook takes d6, black resigned. Obviously, the point here is after queen takes, rook takes, and white's up by quite a few pawns. If we go back to that position, also rook takes rook, queen takes rook. Yeah, and white's still up a few pawns and should win. Yeah, so just to recap, for those of you who don't have enough time to study, a good way to play against a Caro Kann is to play this move, knight to f3, and after d5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight to e5. And when white would usually follow up with d4, bishop to b5 if allowed, castle king side, and just play simple logical chess. Yeah, so I hope you found this one instructive. If you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like, share, and yeah, I'll be happy to see some of your comments below. And yeah, I hope to see you on the next one.